Day 329 of the Trump administration. We begin here with new reaction tonight from Senator Mark Warner, Democrat of Virginia, vice chair of the Intelligence Committee, to a detailed report in the Washington Post about how the president consistently rejects what U.S. intelligence agencies have concluded that Russia indeed waged a covert campaign to interfere in our 2016 election. Washington Post journalist Philip Rucker, who will join us in a moment, is co-author of that report, along with Post journalists Greg Miller and Greg Jaffe, and it's based on interviews with 50 current and former U.S. officials. One of them told the Post that when it comes to talking about Russia, quote, there is an unspoken understanding within the National Security Council that to raise the matter is to acknowledge its validity, which the president would see as an affront. The Post also reports that the daily intelligence update, known as the President's Daily Brief, or the PDB, is structured to avoid upsetting Mr. Trump. A senior intelligence official who also spoke to the Post said, quote, if you talk about Russia, meddling, interference, that takes the presidential daily briefing off the rails. Earlier this evening, I spoke to Senator Mark Warner about the implications of this.
I think this is a real national security concern because every one of Mr. Trump's appointees within the intelligence community all acknowledge that Russia massively intervened in our elections with the effort to try to help Mr. Trump and hurt Hillary Clinton. We all agree that Russia tried to intervene in 21 states' electoral systems. We all understand that Russia used Facebook and Twitter and other social media sites in a way to spew hate and try to drive division. And what I'm concerned about is someone who doesn't want to try to relitigate 2016, but wants to make sure our country is protected in 2018 when you don't have someone in the White House who's kind of leading a whole of government approach. It means that our response to these kind of actions by Russia, and for that matter, other nations that may try to copy Russia's efforts, those national security efforts are undermined by this kind of aversion in the White House to face the reality.
Also tonight, another Washington Post report says that music promoter Rob Goldstone, who set up that June 2016 Trump Tower meeting with the president's eldest son and several different Russians, offered to broker a meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin right after Mr. Trump announced he was running for the White House. President Trump has been outspoken about his admiration for Putin. Today, during a news conference in Moscow, the Russian leader dismissed the investigation into possible collusion during the U.S. election.
You know, all of this has been invented, made up by people who are in opposition to President Trump with a view to shedding a negative light on what President Trump is doing. And for me, it is very bizarre.
Putin went on to praise Mr. Trump, saying, quote, look at how the markets have grown. It attests to the trust investors are showing in the economy, trust in what Trump is doing in this particular field. Tonight, we learned that the two leaders actually spoke by phone. The White House says this, quote, President Trump thanked President Putin for acknowledging America's strong economic performance in his annual press conference. Let's get to our leadoff panel tonight. The aforementioned Phil Rucker, White House bureau chief for the Washington Post and an MSNBC political analyst. Jeremy Bash, former chief of staff at CIA and the Pentagon, an MSNBC national security analyst. And Susan Glasserbeck with us, chief international affairs columnist for Politico. Well, Philip Rucker, what an astounding piece of writing and reporting that you're a part of today. I want to read a bit more of it before asking you about it. Quote, the result is without obvious parallel in U.S. history. A situation in which the personal insecurities of the president and his refusal to accept what even many in his administration regard as objective reality have impaired the government's response to a national security threat. Rather than search for ways to deter Kremlin attacks or safeguard U.S. elections, Trump has waged his own campaign to discredit the case that Russia poses any threat, and he has resisted or attempted to roll back efforts to hold Moscow to account. Philip, it's tough to ask about such a massive piece of writing that when printed out is almost a magazine in and of itself, but we urge all of our viewers to read it for themselves. What stood out to you most? What was your largest takeaway as co-author of this?
Well, I think the big takeaway is that over the last year, President Trump has been reluctant to publicly accept the intelligence conclusions of his own government. He's been skeptical of their findings, and he's felt that any admission that Russia actually did interfere in the election to help him win delegitimizes his presidency and also threatens his ability to forge a friendly relationship with Vladimir Putin, which he sees as critical to a number of foreign policy challenges around the world. And it's not just the president's ego here that's at the center of this story, but there are efforts and sensitivities throughout the government to deal with this. His intelligence briefers are sensitive about bringing any Russia matters to him orally in their daily intelligence briefings. Officials at the National Security Council are doing work at the staff level to try to figure out how to safeguard the U.S. electoral system, our democracy, but they too are sensitive about bringing that to the presidential level. There has been no cabinet meeting. There has been no full National Security Council meeting convened by the president on this issue. And we just see this trickle down throughout the entire federal government, almost a paralysis, if you will, to deal with what, many people in this administration view as a very serious national security threat of a possible future attack from Russia.
Jeremy Bash, because you are a veteran of CIA and the Pentagon, what stands out to you most, and what is the real risk to our security, to ours, to our children's generation?
I was astounded by this reporting, Brian, that CIA briefers and other intelligence analysts actually changed their briefings so as not to bring the president the truth. A presidential daily brief without the truth is not an intelligence briefing. It's story time. It's fiction. And if you're going to give the president only part of the truth, a commander-in-chief is not going to be able to defend the country and protect us. And I fear that this issue is a major national security crisis, Brian. We have issues from Iran's missile proliferation to North Korea's nuclear program that demand and require truth, facts, and intelligence. And if a president of the United States is unwilling to hear it, he is incapable of protecting us.
Susan, you have lived and worked in Russia, among other places. How is Vladimir Putin reading his particular copy of the Washington Post, this story specifically?
Well, look, the fact that this story came out today on the day of Vladimir Putin's annual press conference, a 4-hour-long grueling affair, if you can imagine that. No, President Trump doesn't even have press conferences anymore, never mind 4-hour-long ones. But of course, Vladimir Putin's is sort of a Potemkin press conference. I was amazed today that he was so well briefed, it seemed, on how to flatter and even to suck up to Donald Trump, that he was talking about what a great job Donald Trump did with the stock market, as if they're sharing each other's talking points. For Trump to have called Putin after that press conference, to have thanked him for the positive mention. This is an extraordinary example of why Phil's excellent reporting in the Washington Post is not just a backward-looking affair. We're not just looking back at the election of 2016 and this sort of puzzling historical question about Donald Trump and why he doesn't accept the evidence of Russian intervention. This is very much a story, I think, about Trump trying to proceed and overrule, in effect, his entire national security team and continue in personal diplomacy to make this opening to Russia that no one else can really understand why he persists in it. And to me, that it casts it right into today. But I think it's also very important evidence that the quote-unquote axis of adults around Donald Trump is very limited in what they can accomplish. And there's this incredible, I've written about it as a schizophrenia in our Russian policy today. You have, on the one hand, Trump's very more establishment-minded foreign policy team saying, hey, actually, we're not doing too badly. We still have tough sanctions on Russia. We're working with the Ukrainians. On the other hand, look, Trump is waging his own mutual admiration society with Vladimir Putin, and that has not changed.